Okay, so we have officially started Lent. This is the first Sunday of Lent. As I talked a little bit last week, these are the 40 days leading up to Easter, a time kind of associated with a bit of somberness, with self reflection, with simplicity of recognizing many of the difficulties in life and our own limitations, so that we can celebrate well the fact that God is among us, that He took on all those limitations, all that darkness, to bring new life out of it. So we are going to look at Wayfarers. We are going to look at the book of Lamentations in the Old Testament. So just a kind of quick few things about this. Lamentations is not really one solid book. It's not one big long poem. It's actually probably a series of interconnected poems, kind of a cycle. So they're related. Some themes are picked up in that, but they're also can be separated out just fine. Um, the kind of overall theme, the overall kind of concern of this cycle of poems is the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in 586 before the Common Era, or BC in the older nomenclature. And this was when the city where the temple, the city where God's people, their capital, all that was left was finally breached, was burned to the ground. The prophet Jeremiah was a witness to these events. He's associated with the book of Lamentations. Some people think he wrote it in its entirety. We do know he wrote excellent poetry. We've read some of those things. It's a lot of people think rather than just kind of one person sitting down and writing this thing, it's probably a cycle of poems that he contributed to. Others worked on and re-edited it and wrote some of their own pieces. Again, authorship in the ancient world was very different than the way we view it. These were poems that were kind of in the public domain, and people could add to them and reinterpret them as was most useful for the community. But yeah, again, these poems have to deal with this context, this horrific event of the destruction of God's temple and of the exile. People lost their homeland, became refugees. And the central question there, of course, is a theological one. If God's chosen people, God's representatives in the world, have lost this place, if God's temple represents God's presence on earth, how can kind of the story of God and humanity continue when this has been burned to the ground? And that's kind of the question of when horrific things happen, where is God? And specifically for this people, where is God when the tools, the way he has been relating to humanity up until this point, this group of people who were blessed with God's presence for the sake of blessing the entire world, more or less no longer exist. They are in exile. They are questioning their own identity. They at this point are not sure they're ever going to get to go home. And so the cycle of poems that we now call Lamentations is what deals with that. Just a couple of other things about it is the name Lamentation comes from the first word of the word in Hebrew, which translates to how for us. Just like, how could this happen? How could this happen? How could this happen? It seems to be kind of a reoccurring question. Where is God? How could this happen? The poems themselves also are interesting, that they're very well written. They're very well thought out. In the Hebrew, they've got a very specific, interesting meter that it's called kina, and it basically sounds like limping as you say it. Kind of has this. So even just reading it is somewhat painful. It feels hard and a bit of a slog to get through. Um, and Yeah, it's also an acrostic is another kind of structural piece. This was a type of poetry that they really liked to do, where they would start blocks of text where every single line would start with the same letter. So it doesn't. I mean, it sounds a little sing-songy in English when we do this, but it works really well in Hebrew. So again, the just kind of pain and the pathos that is here, but also in this very well written, very kind of structured way of thinking, is going to be very important to kind of how we read the poems over the long haul. So what we're going to be doing with them at Wayfarers as we look through them is kind of taking sections. We're going to be reading them kind of the Lectio Divina style, which is a style where we're not picking apart the stuff I was just talking about. We're not just going to be looking at the meter and what are the theological implications. We're going to be just listening and feeling them. The assumption in this kind of spiritual reading Lectio Divina is that God in the Spirit knew we would be sitting with this urge right now, that God can speak through this scripture as we read it. So I will, on Sunday, I will read this twice. I'll do that now for those of you looking at this recording. So get back, sit down comfortably, and just listen with hearts. Let words or phrases jump out at you. See what the imagery here is very well done, if not exactly cheerful. It's a bit harrowing. But I'm going to read this section. I'll read it twice, kind of slowly, and just listen briefly for what you feel. I'll share a few of my thoughts, but the real point of this is to spend some time with this passage for each of us. What can we learn from this? How can kind of our reflections going into Lent come from these beautiful but very difficult poetry that we're looking at in Lamentations chapter 1. How she sits alone, the city once great with people. She has become like a widow, great among nations, mistress among provinces, reduced to forced labor. She weeps on through the night, and her tears are on her cheek. She has no consoler from all her lovers. All her friends have betrayed her, have become enemies to her. Judah is exiled in affliction and in hard labor. She dwells among the nations. She finds no rest. All her pursuers overtake her in straits. The roads of Zion mourn without pilgrim festival. All her gates are desolate, her priests are groaning, her virgins are sorrow-stricken, and it is bitter for her. Her foes are the head, her enemies are tranquil, for the Lord has stricken her with sorrow because of all her trespasses. Her babes have fallen captive before the foe. And Zion's daughter is departed from all her glory. Her nobles have become like stags that find no pasture, and they go without strength before the pursuer. Jerusalem recalls in the days of her affliction and her wandering all her treasures that were of yore, as when her people fell into the foe's hand, with none to help her. The foes saw her, and they laughed over her disasters. So let me read that just one more time, then I'll give you kind of just a few things that struck me. But the goal again is not to hear what strikes me, but what strikes you. What feels important? What images grab at you? What might God be saying to you through this first chapter of Lamentations? How she sits alone. The city once great with people, she has become a widow. Great among nations, mistress among provinces, reduced to forced labor. She weeps on through the night, and tears are on her cheek. She has no consoler from all her lovers. All her friends have betrayed her, have become enemies to her. Judah is exiled in affliction and in hard labor. She dwells among the nations, she finds no rest. All her pursuers overtake her in straits. The roads of Zion mourn, without festival pilgrims. All her gates are desolate, her priests are groaning, her virgins are sorrow-stricken, and it is bitter for her. Her foes are the head, her enemies are tranquil, for the Lord has stricken her with sorrow because of her trespasses. Her babes have fallen captive before the foe. And from Zion's daughter is departed all her glory. Her nobles have become like stags that find no pasture. They go without strength before the pursuer. Jerusalem recalls in the days of her affliction and her wandering all her treasures that were in days of yore, as when her people fell to the foe's hand with none to help her. The foes saw her, and they laughed over her disasters. And so the image of this town, this ransacked, destroyed town, as a woman is one that's very common in the Bible. But here we have kind of two pieces. One is kind of God referring to his people, again, as a spouse, right? And the fact that they're always looking and trusting in things besides God, anything they could, is compared to lovers, right? It's like God feels like a spouse who's been cheated on, regularly, systematically almost, that they will not trust God and his ways of doing things just because they're a little counterintuitive. Haven't I shown enough, God keeps saying, right? But then when they're here, it's like they're a widow. They've lost everyone, they've lost everything that they relied on. And the question, just again and again, that I hear in here is, well, where are your lovers now? Where are those who are willing to take from you, but they aren't willing to be here for you when, the shit hits the fan? Where are they? You feel hollow, you feel empty, you have none of the things you relied on. And I think for me, that's kind of just the scary question. What are the things I'm relying on, that I'm trusting in to take care of me when things are hard? Is it truly trusting in God and the fact that he promises to take care of us? Or am I trying to hedge my bets? Am I trusting in, my intellect? Am I trusting in my willpower to work hard? Am I trusting in my bank account? Or maybe my friendships and my family? Those are not bad things, but they can all become bad things when I begin to trust in them and think that they can't be taken away by circumstances in life, right? God promises us to take care of us, and yet we trust in so many other things. And I think we've all been in situations that feel hollow, that feel empty, where the things we thought were our relationships with people felt like they were one way, and they turned out to be very differently. We're disappointed and hollow feeling. Hopefully most of us have not experienced the devastation that they are here, but I think we can learn from it. Will we trust God and God's ways of doing things in the world, even if they feel counterintuitive, even if they feel like they require self-denial at times, rather than find us in this place where that which we trusted betrayed us? It wasn't enough, and now we find ourselves hollow and empty and without the abundance God offers. It's a sombering question, but I think it's an important one to ask maybe before disaster finds us, rather than when it's too late and we find ourselves like God's people that went before us, alone and abandoned and left to kind of the logical consequences that we have brought upon ourselves. Where's the grace? Where's the love? We'll get there in Lamentations. But right now we're sitting with the consequences of our own foolishness and our own stupidity, not trusting God when we had the opportunity. May we learn from our own mistakes, and may we learn from the mistakes of others, from Lamentations 1 as we are going into Lent.